Forests cover 31% of the world's landmass, so you shouldn't be surprised that there are things in the woods that are beyond our understanding. Please join me in welcoming Insomnia for our ventures into the forest. So get comfortable and let the darkness take control. About 10 years ago, I was working as a private investigator. It sounds cool, but it actually isn't. You spend about 3 to 5 hours each day driving to your cases, stake them out in a blazing hot car with the engine off for 8 hours, and then spend 1 to 3 hours in a hotel room writing up your reports before finally getting some sleep and doing it all over again. I did this job for about a year after completing my training to be a medic in the Army Reserves. I was young at the time, so the idea of making $50,000 a year and travelling all over the country whilst living out of a suitcase seemed appealing to 19-year-old me. As I said before, you spend a lot of time driving around in areas you're not necessarily familiar with. On one of those late nights, I found myself driving onto a twisting mountain road just outside of Taos, New Mexico. The area was heavily wooded with narrow roads that curved sharply, without a lot of places to turn off, since you were driving up and around mountains and forests. In the middle of the night, as I maneuvered my rental vehicle through a curve, I saw a woman stumbling along the side of the road carrying a small child. The sight caught me off guard and sent a shiver down my spine. It was so unexpected and so out of place. There were no houses nor buildings around me, and it was around 2 a.m. and pitch black. This unnerved me, but what sent the shiver down my spine was the way she moved. She lurched along with what I can only describe as a shuffle, straight out of a George Romero zombie flick, and she didn't look up or acknowledge me as I drove by. She just stared aimlessly at the road in front of her. You have to remember that I was 19 years old, and fresh out of a year of extensive army training. I was in peak physical shape, and I thought I was Billy Badass at the time. I had spent a month working in trauma centers as part of my training, so I still don't often get freaked out or scared, but seeing this did scare me. I drove on for a minute or two thinking about what I'd just seen. Who was she? What was she doing here this time of night? How did she get here? The more rational part of my brain took over, and I came to a horrifying realization. I had been driving for about 1.5 miles past her, and I hadn't seen any homes nor businesses, nor had I come across any places to turn off since I had seen her. And it had been about 10 miles since I had come across a place to turn before I saw her. This wasn't normal. Something was wrong. I realized that she had to be hurt or in trouble. Perhaps she'd been in a car accident and was in shock. What if the child she was carrying was hurt? I was a medic. I had trained for a year to help people. Sure, I was scared and unnerved. But how would I feel if they later died of exposure out on the mountain, and I was too much of a coward to go back and help? Wouldn't I also be scared the first time I saw combat, when my friends were depending on me? I had to man up and turn around. And as soon as it was safe, I did so. I drove back to where I'd seen her, half relieved and half horrified when I could not find her. I traced the road 6 times. Where could she have gone? There was only a small area on the side of the road and guardrails for miles. I drove, turned around and drove, and turned around and drove, and turned around and drove again. I was obsessed with finding her, Part of it was out of concern for her child. Part of it was proving myself that I was doing the right thing, even though I was scared shitless. After a while, however, it became about me proving it to myself that I wasn't actually going insane. I spent hours looking for her. Eventually I stopped my car and started walking along the road, looking for any signs of her or any disturbance on the mountain to indicate that a vehicle had crashed off the road and down a mountain. I walked that entire 3-mile stretch of road in pitch black with a flashlight, at times yelling like a madman, listening to every twig and echo with bated breath. I didn't even care about my deadline or my next case. I was sure of what I saw. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't seeing things. And I wasn't overly tired. I saw her stumbling down that road, and there's no doubt in my mind. But there was nothing. Even when the sun came up and I drove to the stretch of road again 6 times, there was nothing. And there was no way for me to explain it, even after countless sleepless nights in the 10 years since devoted to it. I don't believe in ghosts. I saw this bullshit documentary and laugh away their evidence in stupid orbs like the rest of you do. But I also don't know where the hell the stumbling woman and her child came from, or where they went. So, on the off chance that you were stumbling down a windy road in Taos, New Mexico about 10 years ago with a toddler in your arms, please, tell me what happened, where you came from, where you went, and that you were both okay. I've been puzzled for a decade now.
When I just turned 18, I figured it'd be best to move out on my own. It isn't like I had family problems or anything like that. I just really wanted to start my life as an adult. I'd often daydream about throwing crazy parties, being able to hook up without having to find a spot, and always having beer in the fridge, and basically just have a ridiculous amount of freedom. So, the summer after high school, I found this small apartment complex on the south side of town. It wasn't anything fancy. 5 apartments to a floor, 3 floors per building, and 7 buildings spaced out along a horseshoe-spaced road, with some woodland surrounding it. My apartment wasn't very big. Now, being fresh out of high school and working a super low-end job as a waiter, I could only afford a small studio apartment. I was fortunate enough to snag one on the 3rd floor so I didn't have to go up any stairs. I planned on going to college, but as some people know, it doesn't always work out that way. After fall and semester started, I still hadn't enrolled. I started doing double shifts at my work to keep myself busy. Living alone in a studio apartment can really take a mental toll on somebody. Seriously, it can. Sitting around all day doing absolutely nothing, waiting to go to work and only really growing older. Not to mention, most of my friends ran off to schools out of state and I was the only one left behind. I'm not throwing any parties by myself or for myself. I'm just saying. Anyway, I'd work these doubles all day. They were roughly 10-hour shifts depending on how busy the restaurant was. I'd come back super late at night, way past when the sun went down, walk through the giant horseshoe back to my apartment that sat all the way on the other end. Now at some point in all of this, I realised that college was out of the question for me, so I started saving money for a new car. I kept most of my tip money in a large box under my bed, and when I'd come home, I'd pull it out, throw the money in, and then go and sleep. Well, that was my intention. The problem is, since I'd be working so much and just being a kid, I always wanted to go and get in some personal time by watching television, playing video games, or throwing on one of my favourite movies. I'd usually be able to stay up all night by doing it. In fact, I'd crush about 4 hours of sleep, then wake up, rinse, repeat. After so long, I couldn't really do this anymore, mainly because I had to cancel my cable in order to pay rent, as well as pawn off some of my gaming systems and DVD players. It really sucked for me. Movies and television were my life. I wanted to go to school to study them, but being an adult, it always costs a lot. Still, even after I had nothing to do, I still couldn't sleep. like some people. I'd stay up all night, smoke a ridiculous amount of cigarettes and just stare out of my window in the middle of the night. Also, where I'm from, we'd get these crazy electrical storms passing from time to time, especially in the late summer or early fall. I just watch those all the time, having nothing to do really, open my eyes to my surroundings. In the end, I actually got to know all the people who like to smoke late at night. I knew how many people like to drive over to Taco Bell past midnight in order to get a snack. I also knew that the entire apartment complex would become a ghost town at around 2 in the morning. There'd be absolutely nothing going on. It'd just be me, either staring out of my window or smoking on my balcony. So one night, I decided to take a walk. I did laps around the horseshoe and listened to an old iPod shuffle. It was also very cold that night, so I wore an old hoodie that I had with the hood up. To be honest, I probably looked extremely suspicious, but honestly, I was just out for a walk. I followed this massive iron fence that wrapped around the entire apartment complex. I was heading back home when I came across something really weird. There was a gate, but it led off into the woods that surrounded the apartment complex. I found it rather weird. I mean, the place was gated, but there was no other place that had a gate on this side of the complex, not to mention that it obviously led to absolutely nowhere. It gave me chills to see that it was open. I just stared off into the harrowing darkness of the surrounding woodland. I hoped to see if anybody was out there, or maybe find somebody to talk to, just so I could forget about it. I didn't know what to do. I just kept moving. Luckily, I could see the gate from my apartment and decided to play a new game. Who opened the gate? After coming home from work, I placed my tips in the box, went to my window and stared out and looked for the gate. I could see it from my apartment, luckily. It was just really hard to see. There wasn't any street lights around that damned thing, and honestly, it looked like there wasn't even anybody there. This time the gate was shut, and when it shut, it blended into the fence perfectly. Nobody could see it unless they were opening the thing, which I did. I didn't bother to tell anybody because I didn't think it was a big deal. To be honest, I thought somebody was going out there to smoke a bowl or do some weird stuff in the woods. Honestly, I didn't know. I didn't really care what was going on behind there, but I did need something to pass my hours. So I'm just sitting there on the balcony waiting for things to happen. It's now way past 2 AM. I'm the only thing awake in this complex as far as I'm concerned, and I'm just smoking away a pack on my times. I then start getting tired and figured out that I'd call it a night, when I suddenly heard a squeaking or creaking sound coming from the iron gate. The metal sounded really rusted. It was way louder from what I remembered a long time ago. I lowered myself down, trying to hide myself amongst the shadows of my balcony. I didn't want to spook whoever it was going into the trees. I squinted my eyes trying to get a good picture. I could then see a shadow moving among the darkness of the tree line, but I soon realised that whoever it was wasn't coming from the apartment complex. They were going in. My first thought was that maybe it was a person who worked on the other side of the forest and used that as a shortcut through. I never saw it happen before, but maybe they discovered a new route or something. Maybe it was one of my neighbours. I thought that until my eyes had adjusted properly to the darkness, however. Whoever came from those trees wasn't a person that lived in my complex. They were physically handicapped. I think they were hunched in their back a bit. Their arms swayed back and forth, almost like they were dragging them lifelessly. The knees of this person were also really close to the ground, more than I could possibly imagine somebody still being able to walk with. The movement of the body was just haunting. I guess that's the right word. The sight of it alone could stop my heart. I couldn't tell the gender of the person, but they did have medium hair that covered a proportion of their face. The person then moved away from the gate, falling around in a very disturbing manner. They mumbled something to themselves. It was still loud enough that I could hear it. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but to be honest, it sounded like gibberish. I figured out whoever this was extremely disturbed. I held my breath as I watched the person move from behind the building across from mine towards the one right next to it. They actually stayed away from the streetlights that lined the horseshoe-shaped drive. They were trying to move through the shadows, avoiding detection as much as possible. I didn't even move an inch. I just watched as they started to make their way to a building. As it made its way towards the front of the building, it quickly looked over its shoulder. In doing so, looking right at me. Now I don't know if they saw me. I don't know if they did, but they were pretty far away and it was dark, but I swear to God their eyes widened and they scurried off into the darkness. They didn't stand there. They didn't change anything about their posture. In that weird low walk they entered with and brushed off faster. It was faster than most people could run. I blinked a few times because I didn't believe it at first, but when I heard that gate slam shut, I knew it actually happened. I didn't sleep at all that night. It felt like it was a terrible thing that had happened to me. I had to call in for the morning part of my shift because I was unable to sleep and let them know that I wasn't going to be going in. After the sun came up, I finally went to work. I ended up having to stay late because one of my tables stuck around after we closed and just wanted a few more drinks with the manager. They were friends or something. I did get a $50 tip, so I really wasn't complaining. When I got home, I went to stash my money in my box. I opened it up and all of my cash remained, but a note read in some of the worst handwriting I've ever seen. I saw you watching me. My heart stopped. How the hell did they know my room number? How did they get in? I started freaking out and wondered if they were still around. Being a studio apartment, they didn't have a lot of places to hide in, so I quickly checked in my bed, under my bed, in my closet, in my bathroom. They were long gone. I took a peek out my window and saw the gate closed. However, the damn brush of woodland swayed back and forth as if somebody was moving in it. I freaked out and called the police. It took them a bit to get there, and when they did, it seemed like the whole apartment came alive. All the lights came on and everybody's come out to see what the disturbance was. When I told the officers what was going on, they made me feel like I was an idiot. They didn't believe me one bit. I had to then tell them where the gate was, but I didn't go down there because I didn't want to show myself. When they went to look, sure enough, the gate was there. Two then went into the forest to look for this thing, and two of them stayed back with me and got my statements. Eventually, the two officers did come back. When they did, they were pale as ghosts. When one of the officers that stayed back with me to take my statement pressured them, they finally opened up. They said they didn't find anybody, but they did find a bunch of personal items hung up in various trees around the forest. They thought it was really weird and they began asking all my neighbours if they were missing anything. Then surely enough, people lined up to go and find that personal items of theirs were missing. Nothing of value. There were pictures inside frames, a hairbrush, books, things like that. Really odd things for somebody to steal. The people at the complex were creeped the hell out. I mean, I saw at least 5 moving trucks the next week. People just wanted to get out of there and I don't blame them. The owners of the complex came and sealed the gate using a blowtorch. Turns out, they had no idea that it was even there in the first place. They didn't put it in. I got out of Dodge when I had the chance. I didn't do my nightly routines anymore, but sure as hell I still couldn't sleep. I left all my lights on and paid my electricity bill and made sure of it. I still couldn't afford to live in that place for much longer anyway. I moved back to the north side of town in a smaller, cheaper apartment complex that wasn't surrounded by woodland. I still have nightmares about all of the things that happened to this day.
I used to regularly walk portions of the Appalachian Trail, and usually take a week or two by myself. Anyway, at one point I was coming over a pass and saw a figure on the trail ahead. Seems to be a lone young woman. It's twilight and the moon will be bright. I have solar rechargeable lamps, and I yell ahead, "Ahoy!" She doesn't break stride or pause. Being on the trail, people are friendly and cooperative. Looks like she's had a bad day, and no tent. Now sure, I like to sleep under the stars, and I usually hike with a hammock and a rainfly, but something seemed off. We were way out here. The last trail shelter was a few miles back, and we were on a very heavy bush cliff. Nowhere you want to camp for the night. I figure she might be wary of strangers at night, so I keep my own pace and don't really pay much more attention to her, until she disappears over the next pass, and I realise she's walking this trail. Now dark, with some moonlight but heavy tree cover, without a torch, lamp or any personal light source, I'm getting worried about this girl. Remember, we are walking with a sheer cliff face a few yards away from us, and conditions aren't perfect. Roots, dirt, mud, moss, rocks, anything can trip you up. So I pick up pace and hurry over to the pass. She's nowhere, and there's a clear line of sight probably 200 yards ahead, and she's nowhere to be seen. But then I see a torch in the distance. Red lamp. Actually, there's two now that I'm getting closer. I flash my torch, and they flash theirs. I call ahoy, and a man and woman respond. We finally meet up and do the whole meet and greet, exchange trail names and chat for a bit about what's ahead in our paths, since we were walking opposite directions. I say to the girl, "You worried me back there. I saw you walking without a light and then you disappeared over the pass. I'm sorry I spooked you. Didn't think you were that far off though. Must have run like crazy to cover as much ground." She looked confused. "What are you talking about?" I explained everything, and she said that she hadn't seen anyone on the trail for at least 3 miles. There was no one reported missing, no abandoned campsites, nothing. I followed up with state police and rangers. Nothing. Who the hell was on the trail ahead of me? Walking at night with no light, minimal gear, and then to just suddenly disappear when there's only one way to go along the trail? I'm still clueless.
When I was about 18, me and some friends took a road trip about 7 or so hours down to the Appalachian National Forest. We were all going to do a little car camping and drink some beers. 18-year-old stuff. As such, we didn't want to be bothered by any national park rangers, so we drove way deep into the woods. So eventually we do get there, set up camp and had some natty lights. And me and a guy decided to go and do a little exploring, so we walked about 100 yards from our site back to the main road. We saw another patch directly across from us. We started walking towards it. Now immediately, we started seeing signs that somebody had lived there for a while. There were big bags of trash, stuff like that. Should have been a huge red flag to turn back, but, we're 18. Eventually, we do manage to reach the site. There's an older white guy who's living out of his van. There's clothing lines strung up all around and coolers placed around it. There's also a big gorgeous dog. I think maybe it's a golden retriever. We tried to back out, but the guy sees us and begins talking to us. To be honest, the guy was friendly enough. He asked us where we're from and things like that. Nothing was too odd at first. He then tells us about some cool spots to check out in the park. We end up chatting for about 10 minutes and going our separate ways. I started to think about how odd it was that this guy had given us directions in step counts and not yards or miles. He was always off balance, not stumbling drunk, but he seemed like he was walking on a balancing beam. He was always swaying side to side. Oh, and he was super excited to talk about the national parks and forests where we're from. Okay, now fast forward 2 months. Camping's over and we pack our tents. Same buddy calls me late at night and tells me to turn on the TV and put the news on. I did oblige. I then see an old dude with a van. You can see exactly where this is heading, but at the time, I didn't. I was just annoyed that my friend had woken me up. No, watch. And then I see the gold retriever and it all clicks to me. What the hell? That man's name was Gary Michael Hilton, convicted of at least 4 murders. He actually took one of his victims on the same Appalachian Trail we're on, only a few weeks after we left.
I used to work security, and several years ago I was assigned to a remote construction site where a summer camp was being built. It was quite literally in the middle of the woods, roughly 4 or 5 miles into the forest, with only a single access road that they'd been using to haul equipment and supplies and such. My job was to provide overnight security, doing a foot patrol of the entire area. The patrol covered around 2 miles, roughly once every hour, and then going back to my post, which was a tiny wooden shack not much bigger than a payphone booth to fill out my logs. Other than the occasional black bear, coyote or bobcat, it was a very boring assignment, with one exception. I was doing a routine patrol one night near the end of my shift, around 3 AM or so. I just passed the gate, where the access road enters the site, when I heard an extremely loud piercing scream that seemed to have come from a distance down the road. It sounded like a woman screaming in absolute terror, and at this point I need to clarify. I hear bobcats pretty often around my house, and encounter them occasionally whilst working in remote areas. They definitely have a distinctive and creepy scream, but there is absolutely no way that this scream was a bobcat. I immediately took off sprinting as fast as I could in that direction. I didn't hear anything else after the initial scream, but about a quarter of a mile down or so, I came upon a car parked just off the side of the road. There was no car in sight when I'd come through on my way to my shift, so it had to have been parked there fairly recently, not running and with no lights on, and no doors open nor anything. I called out to see if anyone was there, but got no reply. I looked around the general area and didn't see anything. Needless to say, I was pretty goddamn sketched out at this point. I ran back to my post and reported what I'd seen to the local police, since there wasn't really anything else I could do. Unfortunately, nothing ever came of it. I've never found out whose scream I heard or what caused it. The car was apparently owned by a guy who lived in the area, but I never heard why he was there. My supervisor suggested that maybe I'd heard a mountain lion or another animal screaming, but I've heard those animal sounds before, and although they're definitely freaky, there's no mistaking an honest-to-God human scream.
I'm an archaeologist, and a few years back, we were doing a massive survey in the middle of nowhere in the interior of BC. All of the crew had gone home and it was just my boss and myself left for a few days to follow up and confirm some coordinates and finish some mapping. We head out from the motel about an hour or so into the bush. We're in the middle of nowhere along deactivated login roads. The closest town is literally miles away. We hike out to this one area that we had found some stuff in a few weeks previously. Now for some reason, the whole area just felt wrong. I don't know how to describe it really. So anyway, we get down to business and about 15 minutes after being hunched over mapping, there's this weird defining whomp sound. I could actually feel the pressure in my ears. I immediately looked to my boss about 20 feet away, who was white as a ghost staring back at me. We're both standing now staring at each other and the same thing happens again. Ear pressure and chest pressure felt like it was just squeezed out. There's chills all over my body and every single hair is standing up on end. My boss just looks at me and says, "Let's go." We grab all of our stuff and speed hike back to the truck. We never discussed it again. I have no clue to this day what it was, but I've been so freaked out that I still haven't forgotten it 10 years later. I still get chills thinking about it now.
A friend of mine and I were hiking through the woods. It was dark out, and we were beginning to head back towards home, when something came across the path by a fallen tree. It's hard to describe, but it looked like a man in a hooded cloak. It stood, and then slowly and silently moved to a tree and keeled. We couldn't see its face, but we got the feeling that we were being watched. We tried to shrug it off and keep moving. Further down the trail, we saw it again. Being in our early teens, we decided stupidly that we were going to get to the bottom of this. So we started after it, and it started charging. We screamed and it stopped, and then took off into the woods. Feeling brave again, I grabbed a big spear-shaped stick and took off after it. I ran for a bit through the woods until I could see the outline of it once more up ahead through the moonlight. I knelt and watched as another popped up beside it, then another, and then I heard moving to the side of me, realizing that whatever these things were, they had surrounded me. I quickly noped out of there in the direction I left my friend, so I know that sounds like the creepy part, but it gets weirder. My friend wasn't there when I'd left him. So I called out to him, and he responded a little away, followed by, "You've got to see this." So I followed his voice and came to a clearing. It was bright as hell, and floating around the clearing were legit balls of light, almost like the fairy fountains from The Legend of Zelda. These were pure white light, and we looked at each other, and then hightailed it back to the trail and went home. It was definitely the strangest and scariest thing I've ever witnessed.
Just a few weeks ago, we're on a road trip from BC to San Diego, and we come off on a campsite just outside of California. We drove through. Now on one side of the campsite it was relatively empty. I noticed a few scattered tents, but nobody close to the location that we ended up picking. We had tons of space. Now we both just wanted an early night, so I started a fire with my girlfriend and started cooking. We ate, had a few beers and climbed up on a rooftop tent with our dog by 9 PM or so. Now I had a pretty hard time falling asleep. I kept on waking up in the night and then falling asleep again. Now in the pitch dark, I suddenly was awoken by the sound of somebody whistling to the sound of When the Saints Come Marching In at around 1 AM. After a few minutes of this repetitive whistling, I nudged my girlfriend and awoken her, who was obviously scared as well. The whistling then turned to the chanting of things like, "When you sleep here you disrespect me, and when you sleep here you're disrespecting the US Marines." The person would then start spelling out words like FLEE. This kept on going and getting more aggressive and even louder in tone, so we decided to make a move. I slowly unzipped the tent while our guard dog was snoring, and I put my head out of the tent. I took a few eyes to let my eyes adjust and figure out where the person was. I felt more confident once I could somewhat see and hear, so I decided to climb down, and the girlfriend passed me the dog and she climbed down too. We flipped the tent up without securing it and we quickly jumped into the truck, while the person was still whistling, and we went to a motel. We just wanted to get away from who or whatever it was making them noises. So the next morning, we drove back to get our belongings. We then saw a family who had been camping over the site, and they said that, apparently, this went on for at least another 3 or 4 hours. It was the scariest thing that their family had ever experienced. The sound seemed to go off into the distance in the woods, and that was the last I ever heard of it.
Over a decade ago, I went to the Amazon jungle, to a family of shamans who had lived on their ancestral ground going back 1,000 years, if not more. All firstborn males in the family followed the path of the ayahuaceros and healers for their community. So I arrive, and since I'm not from the jungle, I am told that we must do a ceremony so the spirits of the jungle would welcome me safely. The ceremony consisted of lots of singing around a fire that was encircled by beautiful flowers and leaves that we had collected and arranged earlier. A cutting of the capi plant was present for this, and held a special center location in the biomandala we had created. The people I stayed with viewed the Kapi plant as representative of Mother Earth, and thus viewed it with reverence. After what felt like hours, the man told me the ceremony was complete and led me to my room located in a separate detached structure on the second floor. There were some windows in the room, and after a short while decided to go to sleep. I was awoken in the middle of the night by a cacophony of sounds. I was hearing various distinct animal sounds. Birds, roars, guttural bellows, screams, sounds that I had never heard before in my life. The thing about it is that the sounds were all so different. They were definitely not all the same species. They all had such vastly different sounds coming from many different locations. I was freaked out, but stayed silent and tried not to move. If I had to estimate, it really felt like over 15 different types of sounds being produced. Then the banging started. It felt like dozens of animals were smashing their bodies into the structure. All around me, there was substantial weight being thrown into the outside walls, whilst the animal cries were going off. I was terrified because the windows were open, but maintained still. I couldn't even move due to the fear of what was just slamming into the walls. So I prayed and prayed for protection, and somehow fell asleep. And I awoke later in the night to a large cockroach crawling on me. The next morning I wake up safe, and no evidence outside of anything having occurred hours ago. I ran into the healer that day, and he asked me how I slept. Not so well, I replied, and explained last night's occurrence. He laughed, and said it was just the jungle welcoming me. I stayed there for around 20 days, and it only happened to me on that first day and never again. I almost have a semi-existential crisis every time I dwell upon this.
I went camping with my girlfriend last year. We arrived at the camping site only to see the ranger putting up signs stating that this was the last weekend the campsite was going to be open due to the season ending. That night, we decided to not bother setting up our tent and just stay in the car because it was a lot warmer. The next morning when we woke up, we noticed there was a huge paw print on the back window right above where our heads were. Thankfully, we didn't have any food in the car, but it was still creepy as hell finding a bear print.
Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I would like to extend a huge thank you to Insomnia for his help in this video. Please be sure to follow me over to his channel to get the next batch of stories in this 2-part collaboration, as the best is yet to come with some of my favourite stories narrated by myself over on his channel. He's a really great guy and an amazing narrator. So, follow me over, link in the description or on screen now. If you enjoyed today's video, please be sure to smash that like button and subscribe, as you won't want to miss what I have in store for you next. Remember that you can submit your scary or paranormal stories to my new official Reddit page, or send it over to my email, both of which can be found in the description. And feel free to follow me on Instagram and Twitter at The Mortis Media for sneak peeks into what goes on behind the scenes. But anyway, for now guys, I'm going to sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.